This is a very quick video now that we've covered the basics in Photoshop, just to look at Adobe Camera Raw, because that's something that we look quite a lot at in the art of photography post-processing side of the course. So I'm just going to drag in an image, a RAW file in particular, into Photoshop. And if you're dragging in RAW files, then generally they'll open up into Adobe Camera Raw. And so this is a shot from Antelope Canyon. And Adobe Camera Raw is really simple to use because it's slider based. So essentially, if we want to, let's say, make the shadows brighter, we can go to the shadows slider and just bring up the shadows. Or let's say we want to bring down the highlights, we can select the highlights slider and just slide them left. Or if we want to brighten up the highlights, we can slide it right. Let's say we put it somewhere down here. We can increase contrast. We can brighten up our entire image through the exposure slider. We can even add local contrast through the clarity slider, which you see brings out some beautiful details in the sides here. So that's before and after. So it's fairly simple to use. If we want to add saturation, we can. In fact, it's a lot more simple than Photoshop. Now, if we want to affect the colors in our image, we can go to the white balance and we can choose auto, and Adobe Camera Raw will automatically calculate it for us. Or we can change the sliders ourselves. So this is the temperature slider. This makes it colder if we move it to the left, and this makes it warmer by moving it to the right. So let's say we're going to move it a little bit to the left, and we can also add some tint to the scene. We can make it slightly greener, or we can make it warmer by adding some magenta. So I'm going to add a little bit of magenta there. Now we also have lots of different options here. So we have a curves layer, just like we did in Photoshop. And the wonderful thing about Adobe Camera Raw is that we're affecting the RAW files. When we take an image into Photoshop, we are editing that image in 8-bit or 16-bit. Now, that isn't accessing all of the data from the RAW files. As soon as we take our images into Photoshop, all that data is lost. But in Adobe Camera Raw or Lightroom, we have full access to the information in our RAW files. So the changes we make often lead to less destruction of quality, or less chromatic aberration, less banding. Generally, it's a cleaner image, and certainly less noise and color noise. So any changes we make in here is usually a cleaner result. But of course, we don't have as many options as we do in Photoshop. So combining Adobe Camera Raw with Photoshop is usually the best option. And you'll see that throughout the course. Now, we can change the contrast just like we could in Photoshop curves. And we can affect individual colors by going to this module here. And we can move these sliders and desaturate or saturate certain colors, so we get very specific control over individual tones, and we can change the hue of these colors, or we can even change the brightness level of these colors. So we're just individually selecting tones and altering them to improve our image. Now, the thing I always use in Adobe Camera Raw is lens corrections. Now, when I click on this, I only ever use remove chromatic aberration and enable profile corrections. And as the name suggests, that cleans up any chromatic aberration we might have around certain objects. And enable profile corrections tries to undo some of the distortion that we see in our photos. So usually some barrel distortion from wide angle lenses. Now, in truth, in Adobe Camera Raw, most of the things I do happen in this panel here, the main panel, and cleaning the image. But there is another very useful thing that we can do, which is added in later on in Lightroom and Adobe Camera Raw. We can go to this brush tool here and click on that. And let's say we want to brighten up just this near area here because it's a little bit dark. Well, what we can do is we can paint in this area here. And you see these sliders. And by the way, if your brush is a little bit small, well, we can change the size of the brush with this thing here. And also the feather, which I like to keep at 100. And now we've got all of these sliders along here. So basically, if we want to bring up the shadows, we can bring up the shadow slider just like that. If we want to add more clarity to this area, so more detail, we can bring along the clarity slider, and you see we're adding more contrast, and it's just to that area that we painted in. And let's say we want to brighten it a bit more, we can bring up the exposure a little bit more. And if that area is becoming a little bit overexposed, we can bring down the highlights a little bit. And now if we want, we can click on New, And so now we can just select, say, an area up here, and we can start changing the sliders just to suit that area. And you see, we're not affecting the wall to the right here, which we previously affected. So we're bringing up the highlight slider, and we're just going to brighten up these highlights a little bit. So I'm going to bring up the exposure. Maybe I'll bring down the clarity slider a little bit and bring down the shadows just a little bit there. And now if I want, I can apply whatever changes I just did there to a smaller brush and paint down this ray of light. You see, so we're brightening up that ray of light significantly. Now I think it's a little bit strong at the bottom, so I'm going to undo that and just brighten it up gently there. And that's much better. And now if I want to create, let's say, a vignette around here, so I want to darken around here, I can do new again, and I can paint in this area, and you see we're just keeping the last brush's settings, but that's okay because we can now bring everything down. So let's bring down the exposure, and we can keep the shadows down there a little bit, but if we want, we can also bring up the clarity because we need a little bit of detail in that area. I'm going to paint it in a little bit more along there. And if it's a little bit bright, we can bring down the shadows a bit more, bring down the exposure a little bit more, bring up clarity. So we're bringing in a nice vignette along here while also bringing in some details. Now I think that's a little bit dark, so I'm just going to brighten it up a tiny bit. And now if we want to undo any of these changes, I can select, let's say, this point here, and watch, I can bring down the slider just in case it's a little bit overexposed. So again, just like using Photoshop inside Photoshop with layers, this is a non-destructive process too. And of course, we can crop our image and we can straighten our image just like we do in Photoshop. And if we're finished, we can choose the hand tool, let's say, and we can open our image in Photoshop just by pressing open image. But if you want to open it up and have the ability to come back into Adobe Camera Raw at any time, we can hold down Shift and you'll see it changes to open object. And this means we're going to open the layer up as a smart object, just as we've done before. But this time with a smart object, you see we have this little thumbnail here, this little icon. If we double click on that layer, we bring Adobe Camera Raw back up and we get access to all that fantastic raw data. So that's really all I wanted to show you for Adobe Camera Raw, just because when we get to the Art of Photography course and I use Adobe Camera Raw, I didn't want to confuse you. Now we don't use Adobe Camera Raw too much in the course, we just use it to prepare raw files for exposure blending. So that brings us to the end of our beginner's course. I hope you found it useful. Again, don't feel frustrated if it seems a little bit difficult. That's a huge amount of information to take in just a short space of time. So give yourself a break, practice, play with your images, don't be scared to explore every part of Photoshop, and go on YouTube, check out my channel. I've got a lot of free tutorials that can bring you up to speed. So in the meantime, good luck with that, and I hope you enjoy the course.